Chapter 1. Most people fear the dark, but I had learned to fear the fine print. My name is Elena Vance, and I am an asset recovery agent. It's a sanitized corporate title for a job that most people find repulsive. I am the person who arrives when the dream is over. I am the physical manifestation of a default notice. I've spent my career walking into the ruins of lives, carrying the legal weight to take back mansions, yachts, and private jets when the payments stop hitting the bank. I've been called a vulture, a thief, and a heartless shill for the elite. I've faced down weeping heirs, crooked politicians, and angry men with more money than sense. Through it all, I've never once let my hand shake. I thought I knew every kind of monster the world had to offer. I was wrong. The evening was suffocating as I pulled my sedan up to the gates of the Blackwood Estate. A storm was bruising the sky purple and black, and the air felt thick enough to swallow. My GPS had cut out 3 miles back, the digital map spinning aimlessly in the middle of the dense forest that bordered the property. But I didn't need a satellite to tell me I was in the right place. The gates were 12 feet of wrought iron. It twisted into jagged shapes that looked less like decorative metalwork and more like reaching claws. Behind them, a driveway of crushed grey stone disappeared into a fog so dense it seemed alive, swirling against the bars as if trying to escape. My boss, Marcus, had been uncharacteristically tense when he handed me the folder that morning. His office had been dark, the blinds drawn tight. "Silas Vane," he had said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He's defaulted on a $300 million construction loan. He's ignored every notice. Go in there, get his signature on the voluntary surrender form, or serve him the eviction. Do not leave until he knows he's lost." I adjusted my blazer, checked the sharp line of my ponytail in the rearview mirror, and tucked my heavy leather briefcase under my arm. I stepped out of the car, and the gravel crunching under my heels like bone. I expected the gate to be locked, but the moment my fingers brushed the cold iron, it swung inward with a heavy, rhythmic groan. It was a sound like a long-forgotten warning. I began the walk toward the house. The trees here were different from any I'd seen in the suburbs. These were ancient oaks with bark the colour of dried blood, their branches interlaced overhead like skeletal fingers that blotted out what little light remained in the sky. There were no birds singing, no insects chirped in the high grass. The only sound was the rhythmic click-clack of my heels and the sound of my own breathing, which was becoming embarrassingly fast. Then, the house emerged from the mist. It wasn't just a home, it was a fortress of black granite and floor-to-ceiling glass, perched precariously on the edge of a jagged cliff. It looked expensive, imposing, and utterly lethal. I stepped onto the porch and reached for the heavy brass knocker, but the door drifted open before I could touch it. I hesitated. As a professional, I should have waited, but the default notice in my bag felt like a heavy weight. I stepped inside. The foyer was vast, smelling of expensive cedar, old books, and a strange metallic scent that reminded me of a forest floor after a heavy rain. It was silent, save for the distant low hum of what sounded like a generator, or perhaps a growl. "Mr. Vane," I called out. My voice echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings, swallowed quickly by the shadows. "My name is Elena Vance with Apex Recovery. I'm here regarding the Blackwood account." I followed a faint, flickering light at the end of the hall, leading me into a library that looked like a temple to ancient knowledge. Thousands of leather-bound books climbed the walls toward a ceiling lost in darkness. At the far end, seated behind a massive mahogany desk, was Silas Vane. He didn't look like a man who was $300 million in debt. He was draped in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my annual salary, his shoulders broad and his posture radiating a terrifying stillness. His hair was black as a raven's wing, but it was his eyes that stopped my heart. They were amber, bright, intelligent, and flecked with gold. They looked far too vibrant to belong to a normal human being. "You're late, Elena," he said. His voice was a deep, velvety rumble that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "I expected the bank to send their vultures hours ago." I cleared my throat, forcing myself into my professional persona. "If you knew I was coming, Mr. Vane, then you know why I'm here. Your grace period ended at midnight. I have the surrender documents here. If you sign now, we can make the transition quiet. No police, no public scandal." I walked toward the desk, my hand trembling just slightly as I pulled the papers from my briefcase and laid them out on the polished wood. Silas didn't even glance at the paperwork. He watched me. As I got closer, I felt a wave of heat radiating from him, a physical pressure that made the hair on my arms stand up. He tilted his head, his nostrils flaring slightly as if he were catching my scent. "Tell me, Elena," he said, leaning forward into the light of the single desk lamp. "Did Marcus tell you what this land was before he built his dreams on it?" "My boss doesn't share history lessons, Mr. Vane. He shares balance sheets, and yours is in the red. This land is a graveyard for those who take what isn't theirs," Silas replied. He reached out, his hand hovering over the legal documents. I watched his fingers, noticing how elegant they were, until I blinked. For a split second, his fingernails seemed to sharpen, lengthening into dark, jagged points. With a sudden, violent motion, he didn't grab the pen. He slammed his hand down on the papers. The sound was like a gunshot. I jumped back, gasping as the heavy mahogany desk actually splintered under his palm. The legal documents weren't just torn, they were shredded into white confetti, as if a wild animal had lashed out at them with claws. "What the? Oh, you can't do that," I stammered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "That's a legal summons." "Your laws are written in ink, little bird," Silas said, standing up and towering over me. "Mine are written in bone." He moved around the desk with a predator's grace, too fast for a human to track. Before I could even turn to run, he was behind me. I could feel the heat of his body, smelling that intoxicating scent of rain and wood. He leaned down, his breath warm against the nape of my neck, sending a shiver through me that felt less like fear and more like a spark of electricity. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered. "Marcus didn't send you to collect a debt. He sent you as an offering." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm leaving, right now." I spun around, intent on bolting for the door. But Silas's hand shot out, catching my arm. His grip was a vice of warm iron. He pulled me close, his eyes glowing with an internal molten light. "Look at the windows, Elena," he commanded. I looked. Outside, the fog had turned into a swirling vortex of white, and within that white, I saw them. Pairs of eyes, dozens of them, yellow, red, and orange circling the house in a silent, predatory dance. "The gates didn't open because I wanted you in," Silas growled, a low rumbling sound starting deep in his chest. "They opened because they wanted you in. And my doors, they only open one way." The heavy bolt on the front door slid home with a definitive thud, seemingly moved by no human hand. I was trapped in the dark with a man who wasn't a man, surrounded by a forest full of nightmares. "Welcome to the Blackwood Estate, Elena," Silas said, his grip tightening. "I hope you brought more than just paperwork, because tonight we find out exactly what you're worth." Chapter 2. The Predator's Parlor. The silence that followed the heavy thud of the door was more terrifying than any scream. I stood frozen, my arm still held in Silas's iron-like grip. I could feel the heat radiating from him, a living furnace that made the air in the library feel thin and charged with static. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glowing eyes of the forest continued their slow, rhythmic circling, like sharks in a white sea of fog. "Let go of me," I managed to say, though my voice sounded small and brittle. Silas didn't release me immediately. Instead, he leaned in closer, his nostrils flaring as he took a deep, deliberate breath near my temple. You smell of cheap city perfume and high-octane anxiety, Elena. But underneath the surface, there is something else. Something ancient and silver. He finally let go, stepping back into the shadows of the mahogany desk with a grace that felt entirely too fluid. You want to leave? Go ahead. Try the door. See how far your legal training gets you against a lock that hasn't changed since the world was cold. I didn't wait for a second invitation. I bolted. I ran down the long, cedar-scented hallway, my heels skidding on the polished marble. My heart was a drum in my ears, drowning out the sound of the storm outside. I reached the massive front door and grabbed the brass handle, pulling with every ounce of strength I possessed. It didn't budge. It wasn't just locked. It felt fused. As if the wood and metal had become one solid piece of the mountain itself. "It won't open," I whispered, leaning my forehead against the cold wood. "It's a trick. Some kind of magnetic security system." "It's not a trick, Elena. It's an invitation," Silas's voice drifted down the hall. He hadn't followed me, yet his voice sounded as clear as if he were standing right behind me. I turned back, my breathing shallow. I was a professional. I was a senior asset recovery agent. I was trained to deal with difficult clients and hostile environments. But Silas Vane wasn't a client. He was a catastrophe. I forced myself to walk back to the library, trying to steady my hands. He was sitting in his chair again, watching the shredded remains of the loan documents on his desk as if they were nothing more than fallen leaves. "My boss? Marcus, he told me you defaulted," I said, my voice gaining a bit of its usual edge. "He gave me a file. A $300 million loan for a luxury resort project. That money is real, Silas. The bank expects it back." Silas chuckled, a dark, dry sound that sent a fresh wave of goosebumps down my arms. He reached into a hidden drawer in the desk and pulled out a book. It wasn't a modern ledger with spreadsheets and digital receipts. It was bound in tarnished silver filigree and wrapped in skin that looked far too old to be parchment. "This is the real silver ledger," Silas said, sliding it across the wood toward me. "Look at the entries, Elena. Tell me if you see any mention of a bank or a resort." I stepped forward, my curiosity momentarily overriding my fear. I opened the heavy cover. The pages were covered in elegant, flowing script, but it wasn't written in ink. The letters shimmered with a dull, metallic light that seemed to pulse. I scanned the names, my eyes widening as I saw dates stretching back hundreds of years. Next to each name was a value, but not in dollars. This is nonsense," I stammered, closing the book with a snap. "This is some kind of role play. A cult." "Is it?" Silas stood up, his amber eyes pinning me to the spot. "Marcus didn't send you here to collect money. He doesn't work for a bank, and neither do you. Apex Recovery is a front, a cleaning service for the supernatural world. Marcus is a rogue, a wolf who was cast out of my pack for blood crimes decades ago. He owes this ledger a debt that cannot be paid in currency. He sent you as a peace offering. The bribe to keep me from hunting him down and ending his line." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. My entire career, my life in Chicago, my hard-earned promotion. It was all a lie. "I'm just a collector," I whispered, the reality of the situation beginning to bleed through. "I'm human. Why would he send me?" Silas walked around the desk, stopping just inches from me. He reached out, his thumb brushing against the pulse point in my neck, where my heart was still racing. "Because he knows what you are, even if you don't. You aren't just a human, Elena. And now that you've crossed my threshold, you belong to the ledger. You belong to me." As he spoke, a howl erupted from the forest outside, closer this time. It was followed by the sound of something heavy slamming against the glass of the library window. The circle was closing. All Chapter 3. Sleep was an impossibility. Silas had confined me to the infirmary wing, a suite of rooms that looked more like a 5-star hotel than a medical ward, save for the faint, clinical scent of antiseptic, and the silver bars across the windows. I sat on the edge of the velvet-draped bed, watching the fog outside. It was thinning now, revealing the dark, twisted shapes of the oaks, and the things moving between them. The attack came without warning. A sound like shattering glass echoed through the mansion, followed by a howl so visceral and primal it made my teeth ache. I ran to the door, my breath catching in my throat, but it was already being thrown open. Silas was there. His charcoal suit jacket was gone, and his white silk shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing a glimpse of bronzed, corded muscle. He looked wilder than he had an hour ago. His skin was flushed, and I could see his pulse thundering in the hollow of his throat. "Stay behind me," he roared, his voice sounding more like a snarl than human speech. Out of the darkness of the hallway, 3 figures emerged. At first glance, they looked like men, but they moved with a jarring, twitching gait that made my stomach churn. Their skin was the colour of a wet sidewalk, grey and sallow, and their eyes were clouded over with a thick, milky film. "The Hollowed," Silas hissed, his body tensing as he stepped into a defensive crouch. "Feral rogues who have lost their humanity. Marcus's pets." One of the creatures leaped, its fingers unnaturally elongating into jagged black claws. Silas didn't flinch. He met the creature in mid-air, but he wasn't a man anymore. In a blur of motion that defied the human eye, his body expanded. I heard the sickening sound of bones snapping and reforming. Thick silver-grey fur erupted from his skin, and his face elongated into a powerful predatory muzzle. Within seconds, a massive wolf, the size of a grizzly bear, stood where the man had been. The wolf was a masterpiece of lethal beauty. Its fur shimmered like moonlight on a dark lake, and its eyes remained those same piercing amber orbs. With one swift, brutal movement of its jaws, it crushed the throat of the first attacker. The creature didn't bleed red. A dark, oily substance sprayed across the marble floor. I scrambled back, my mind refusing to process the impossible reality before me. This wasn't a hallucination. Silas Vane was a monster. The other 2 Hollowed lunged simultaneously. So Silas, the wolf, slashed out with a massive paw, his claws leaving deep smoking gouges in the floor. But one of the rogues was fast. It managed to sink its teeth into Silas's shoulder. A high, pained yelp tore from the wolf's throat, a sound so human it broke my heart. I saw it then. The rogue's teeth were coated in a dull, metallic liquid. Silver. Silas shook the creature off, slamming it against the wall with enough force to crack the stone, but he stumbled. His movements became sluggish, his head swinging low as the poison began to work through his system. One of the feral wolves saw its opening and turned its attention to me. It snarled, a string of black saliva dripping from its maw as it crouched to spring. I had nothing but my empty hands. I threw them up to protect my face as the creature lunged. A sharp and searing pain erupted in my forearm as its claws found purchase, but then the world seemed to stop. My blood didn't just flow, it began to glow. A soft, incandescent silver light pulsed from the wound, illuminating the dark hallway. The rogue froze mid-air. It sniffed the air, its cloudy eyes widening in what looked like sheer, primitive terror. It backed away, whimpering and tucking its tail like a beaten dog. Silas, despite his injury, let out a thunderous growl that shook the very glass in the windows. He lunged one last time, obliterating the remaining threats. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Silas began the agonizing process of shifting back, his bones snapping back into place with a sound like dry wood breaking. He stood there, bloodied and breathing hard, his human skin slick with sweat. He didn't look at the dead creatures. He looked at my arm. He walked toward me, his hand trembling as he took my wrist. He leaned down, his tongue darting out to taste the silver-tinged blood on my skin. He let out a low groan, a sound of pure, unadulterated hunger and recognition. "You're blood, he whispered, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. It tastes like the moon itself. Who are you, Elena Vance? Chapter 4. The morning brought no sunlight, only a pale, bruised grey haze that clung to the windows of the library. The storm had passed, but the air remained thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of the previous night's slaughter. Silas had dressed in a fresh suit of obsidian black, though I noticed the slight stiff hesitation in his movements, a lingering ghost of the silver poisoning. I sat across from him, my arm bandaged in a wrap of fine Egyptian silk that Silas had insisted on applying himself. The wound no longer burned. Instead, it hummed with a strange, low-frequency vibration that seemed to match the rhythm of the house. "You have Lunar-Pure blood, Elena," Silas said, his voice a low, clinical rumble. He was pacing the length of the mahogany desk, his eyes never leaving mine. "It is a genetic anomaly. We're a relic of the old world that was thought to have been bred out of existence centuries ago. To my kind, it is the ultimate medicine. It neutralizes silver, heals the deepest wounds, and it can turn a normal alpha into something far beyond the reach of death." "I'm a senior agent for a recovery firm in Chicago, Silas," I said, my voice cracking despite my attempt at stoicism. "I have a mortgage, a car payment, and a cat who is currently very confused about why I haven't come home. I don't have magic blood." "You have a GPS chip in your briefcase," Silas countered, pointing a sharp finger at the leather bag I had carried into the estate. "And Marcus has the receiver." I looked at the briefcase sitting innocently on the floor. I had carried it to every meeting for 3 years. It was a gift from Marcus on the day I was promoted. My stomach twisted as I knelt beside it, my hands shaking as I tore at the inner lining of the back pocket. There, tucked behind a seam, was a small, blinking red light, the size of a ladybug, but with the weight of a death warrant. "He's using me," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow to the chest. "He didn't send me as a bribe. He sent me as a Trojan horse. He wanted to find your stronghold, and he wanted my blood to fuel whatever nightmare he's building." "He wants to harvest you, Elena," Silas said, his face hardening into a mask of cold, predatory fury. "He wants to create an army of hybrids that can't be killed by silver. And you brought him right to my front door." A sudden, sharp chime echoed through the library. It wasn't a phone, it was coming from the briefcase. A small, high-resolution screen I hadn't noticed before flickered to life within the flap. It was a video feed. Marcus sat in a dark, industrial room, his face illuminated by the cold blue glow of a computer monitor. He looked exactly as he always did, polished, professional, and utterly calm. But next to him, bound and gagged in a heavy wooden chair, was my younger sister, Sarah. Her eyes were wide with a terror that tore through my soul. "Hello, Elena," Marcus's voice came through the small speaker, sounding oily and intimate. "I hope you're enjoying the hospitality of the Blackwood Estate. You have something Mr. Vane wants, and he has something I want. But I have Sarah, and Sarah is very, very fragile." "Marcus, don't you dare touch her," I screamed at the screen, my nails digging into the leather of the bag. "The trade is simple, Elena. You walk out of those gates and come back to me. In exchange, I let Sarah go. If you stay, well, I'll send her to Silas in pieces. You have 1 hour to decide which debt you're going to pay." The screen went black, leaving my own horrified reflection in the glass. I turned to Silas, my eyes burning with unshed tears. "I have to go. I'm leaving now." "He'll kill you the moment he has you in his grasp," Silas said, stepping in front of the library door to block my path. "I don't care. It's my sister Silas. I'm not letting her die for some ancient wolf feud." Silas stepped into my space, his hands gripping my shoulders with a strength that was both terrifying and strangely grounding. He leaned down, his amber eyes burning with a molten light. "I won't let you go back to him. Not as a victim," he growled. If you're going to face a rogue who has spent decades planning this, you're going to do it as a Blackwood. We aren't going to pay the debt, Elena. We're going to cancel it. Chapter 5. The next hour was a blur of adrenaline, sweat, and the crushing weight of a deadline I couldn't afford to miss. Silas didn't waste time with comforting words. He knew that the only way to save Sarah was to turn my fear into a weapon. He led me deep into the lower levels of the mansion, past the wine cellars and the stone-walled archives, into a gym that felt more like a gladiator's pit. The air here was cool and smelled of iron, old wood, and the faint lingering scent of Silas's own musk. He didn't hand me a gun or a sleek tactical knife. Instead, he stood behind me, his body a wall of heat that made my skin prickle. He placed his large, calloused hands over mine, guiding my stance. "A wolf doesn't fight with its hands, Elena," he whispered into my ear, his chest vibrating against my back. "A wolf fights with its senses. You've spent your whole life looking at the world through a human lens, seeing only what's in front of you. To survive, Marcus, you have to see what's hidden. Close your eyes." I wanted to protest, to tell him we were wasting time, but the authority in his voice was absolute. I closed my eyes. Darkness rushed in, and with it, the frantic image of Sarah tied to that chair. "Don't focus on the girl," Silas commanded, as if reading my thoughts. "Focus on the house. Don't listen to the wind or the hum of the ventilation. Listen to the heartbeat. Every living thing has a pulse. Every creature has a rhythm. Even the trees outside have a slow, deep thrum. Find it." I took a shaky breath, trying to push past the panic. At first, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the world began to expand. It was as if I were underwater and the sounds were finally reaching me from the surface. I heard a rhythmic thump-thump from the floors above, the housekeeper moving through the halls. I heard a faster, lighter flutter, a bird nesting on the granite eaves of the roof. And then I felt it, a deep, heavy thrumming that seemed to match the frequency of my own soul. It was powerful, steady, and ancient. "That's me," Silas murmured, his grip on my hands tightening. The moment he said it, a jolt of energy surged through me. It wasn't just heat, it was a connection. For a terrifying, beautiful second, our pulses fused. I saw what he saw, the heat signatures of the room. The vibrant life flowing through the walls and the raw, overwhelming power of the Blackwood Pack. I felt his crushing loneliness, yes, but also a growing white-hot obsession with my safety that made my breath hitch. "Our heartbeats," I whispered, my eyes snapping open. "They're in sync." Silas pulled away abruptly, his expression pained, almost haunted. The fated mate bond was no longer a theory. It was a physical tether, pulling at my very core. He was fighting it, trying to maintain the distance of a mentor, but the amber in his eyes was burning with a molten hunger that told me he was losing that battle. "You can hear them now, can't you?" he asked, his voice strained. I nodded. Beyond the reinforced walls of the gymnasium, I could hear them, dozens of fast, jagged, irregular heartbeats. They sounded like static, broken and hungry. The rogues were no longer just circling. They were closing in, waiting for Marcus to give the word. "Marcus thinks you're a lamb, Elena. He thinks he's been grooming a victim for 3 years, Silas said, reaching for a rack on the wall and handing me a small, elegant dagger. The blade was dark, but the edge shimmered with a fine coating of silver. "He's about to find out he's been training a queen. Let's show him you've finally found your teeth." I gripped the hilt, the silver light from my palm reflecting off the steel. I wasn't the woman who had walked into these gates yesterday. The debt collector was dead. The Seer was waking up. Chapter 6. We didn't take the driveway. To leave by the front gates would have been a suicide mission, a direct path into the sights of Marcus's snipers. Instead, Silas led me through a hidden passage beneath the library, a narrow, stone-ribbed tunnel that smelled of damp earth and ancient iron. When we finally emerged, we were nearly a mile from the mansion, standing in the heart of the Whispering Pines. It was a section of the forest where the trees grew so thick that the sun never touched the ground, even at high noon. The pines were massive, their bark dark and craggy, and their needles formed a carpet that muffled every sound. Silas moved in his human form, but he was different out here. His steps were hauntingly silent, his eyes scanning the canopy with an intensity that made him look less like a billionaire and more like a god of the hunt. "Stay close, and whatever you do, do not step off the path I set," he cautioned, his voice barely a breath. "The trees here react to the presence of blood. They remember the wars fought on this soil long before your kind built cities." As we moved, I began to hear it. The pack link. It wasn't a choir of voices in my head, but a flood of raw, unfiltered emotion. Because of my blood, the psychic barrier that usually kept humans out was beginning to dissolve. I felt Silas's crushing sense of duty, the weight of centuries spent protecting a pack that was slowly being picked off by the modern world. And underneath it all, I felt a growing white-hot obsession with my safety that made my skin tingle. It was overwhelming, like trying to breathe while submerged in someone else's soul. "You're distracting me, Elena," the voice echoed in my mind, crystal clear. I gasped, stumbling slightly as I looked at him. His lips hadn't moved. He was still 10 feet ahead of me, his back turned as he scouted the brush. "I can hear you," I thought, testing the connection. He stopped and turned, his amber eyes flashing with a mix of awe and irritation. "The blood bond is stronger than I realized. You aren't just a carrier of the line, Elena. You're a catalyst. You're opening doors I thought were locked forever." Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet felt hollow. I didn't even have time to scream. It was a perfectly camouflaged pit. A wolf trap lined with stakes that shimmered with the dull, lethal grey of silver. I felt the sickening lurch of gravity, but Silas was a blur. He didn't try to grab my hand. He knew he couldn't pull me up in time. Instead, he threw his own body into the pit beneath mine, twisting in midair to ensure I landed on top of him. We hit the bottom with a thud that knocked the wind out of me. Silas let out a choked, guttural scream, a sound of pure agony that vibrated through my bones. 3 of the silver-tipped stakes had pierced his shoulders and thighs, pinning him to the earth. The smell of burning flesh immediately filled the small, dark space. Silver was a corrosive acid to his kind, a poison that didn't just hurt, it ate away at their ability to heal, locking them in a cycle of permanent trauma. "Silas!" I scrambled off him, my hands shaking as I saw the smoke rising from his wounds. "Don't touch the metal," he gasped, his face turning a sickly, ashen grey. His eyes were unfocused, the gold in them flickering like a dying candle. "Get out! Run! The scouts, they're coming!" Above us, silhouettes began to break the line of the pit's edge. Where they weren't shifting into wolves. They were staying in their twisted half-human forms, peering down at us with hungry, mocking grins. They knew the silver would do the work for them. They didn't need to fight a king when they could watch him rot. Chapter 7. The rogues didn't jump into the pit. They were scavengers, not warriors, and they knew the silver was doing the heavy lifting for them. They paced the perimeter above, their low, vibrating growls harmonizing with the wind through the pines. To them, we were already dead. They were just waiting for the king's heart to stop so they could claim the bounty Marcus had placed on his head. Silas was fading fast. The silver stakes acted like lightning rods for agony, drawing the poison deep into his marrow. His skin, usually so warm and vibrant, had turned the colour of slate. His eyes were half closed, his breath coming in shallow, hitching gasps that rattled in his chest. Every time he tried to shift, to use the raw power of the wolf to heal, the silver reacted, sending fresh jolts of corrosive pain through his nervous system. "Silas, look at me," I whispered, cradling his head in my lap. "You have to stay with me." "Can't." "Move," he wheezed, his fingers clawing weakly at the dirt. "The silver, it's in my blood, Elena. Run, use the ladder, on the far side. They won't follow you, if they have me." I looked at the stakes. They were buried deep. If I pulled them out, the physical trauma alone might kill him in his weakened state. If I left them in, the poison would finish the job within minutes. I looked up at the shadows above, then down at my own trembling hands, and I remembered what he had told me in the gym, that my blood was a catalyst, that it was the ultimate medicine. "I'm not leaving you," I said, my voice suddenly cold and steady. "And I'm not playing by Marcus's rules anymore." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the small, silver-tipped dagger Silas had given me. It felt heavy, a piece of ancient justice in my hand. I didn't hesitate. I drew the blade across the palm of my left hand, a clean, deep slice that made me hiss through my teeth. The reaction was instantaneous. As the first droplets of my blood hit the air, the silver light flared. Not a soft glow this time, but a brilliant, incandescent shimmer that illuminated the entire pit. The rogues above let out a collective yelp of pain, shielding their eyes from the purity of the light. I didn't just let the blood drip, and I pressed my palm directly onto the largest wound in Silas's shoulder, right where the silver stake met his flesh. The sound that followed was like water hitting a white-hot furnace. A hiss of steam rose from the wound, smelling of ozone and burnt metal. Silas's body arched off the ground, a strangled roar tearing from his throat. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the silver light from my veins traveled into his, chasing the darkness away. The black veins that had been spreading across his neck retreated like shadows before the sun. The grey pallor vanished, replaced by a flush of violent, surging power. Silas's eyes snapped open, but they weren't amber anymore. They were pure, glowing white, devoid of pupils, radiating the raw authority of an alpha king. Silas didn't just stand up, he exploded. He didn't bother with the ladder. With a single earth-shaking leap, he vaulted out of the pit. He didn't even shift into his wolf form. He didn't need to. In his human shape, he moved with a speed that blurred the very air, a silver-streaked hurricane of vengeance. I scrambled out of the pit, just in time to see the end of it. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. The rogues, paralyzed by the sheer pressure of his aura, couldn't even flee. Silas moved through them like a reaper, his bare hands performing the work of a dozen blades. Within seconds, the clearing was silent. Silas stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving, his white silk shirt now a tapestry of rogue blood. He slowly turned to face me. The white light in his eyes began to recede, melting back into the familiar molten amber I had grown to crave. "You saved me," he said. His voice sounding like two mountains grinding together. He looked down at his own hands, then at the healing scar on my palm. "You didn't just heal me, Elena. You fed me. I can feel you. In every cell." "We're even," I said, though my legs felt like water. "Now no more traps. Let's go get my sister." Chapter 8. Marcus's base was a skeletal nightmare of rusted iron and cracked concrete, an abandoned industrial warehouse sitting on the jagged edge of the county line. As we approached, the air grew cold, carrying the heavy, cloying scent of chemical rot and the sharp copper tang of too much blood. This wasn't a place of business. It was a factory of suffering. We moved through the shadows of the loading docks, Silas using his enhanced senses to navigate the maze of discarded machinery. He didn't speak, but through our bond, I could feel his hackles rising. He was a silent shadow at my side, his presence a dark, protective cloak. Inside, the reality of Marcus's ambition was laid bare. The main floor was filled with rows of floor-to-ceiling glass tanks, illuminated by a sickly green light. Inside them, shapes flickered. Creatures that were neither human nor wolf, their bodies distorted by forced transformations and scarred by failed experiments. They were the hollowed I had seen earlier, but in their early, agonizing stages. "He's trying to recreate the original Pack," Silas hissed, his claws extending with a sharp shink of sound. "But you cannot force the moon into a bottle. He's creating monsters because he lacks the soul to lead a pack." I followed Silas toward a central glass-walled office that overlooked the horror. On the desk, illuminated by a single lamp, sat a second ledger. It was a dark, tattered reflection of the silver-bound book Silas owned. I walked toward it, my hand trembling as I flipped open the cover. I didn't see names of debts. I saw a genealogy. "Silas," I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. "Look at this." He leaned over me, his heat a steady anchor in the cold room. I pointed to the names written in jagged, frantic ink. Vance. 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 I saw my mother's name, marked with a red circle. I saw my grandmother's name dated 1982. I saw my great-grandmother, a woman I had never known. "The Vance line," Silas read, his amber eyes darkening with realization. "You weren't just a random recovery agent, Elena. Your family was the high seers of the Blackwood Pack centuries ago. You were the ones who saw the paths before they were walked. Marcus didn't find you by accident. He's been tracking your family for 3 generations, waiting for the pure blood to manifest again. He didn't hire you. He grew you." The weight of the betrayal felt like a physical blow. My entire life, the career I'd built, the mentor who had guided me, it was all a long-term investment. I was a crop waiting to be harvested. "Elena!" Sarah's voice shattered the silence. It was a thin, terrified scream echoing from the far end of the warehouse, beyond a set of heavy steel doors. I didn't wait for Silas to scout. I ran, my heels pounding against the concrete, the pulse in my blood screaming in time with her heart. We burst into a wide, open bay, and the scene was set for a nightmare. Marcus stood on a raised steel catwalk, holding a detonator in his left hand and a jagged silver knife to Sarah's throat with his right. But it was the thing standing behind him that stopped my breath. It was a creature 10 feet tall, its muscles bulging with unnatural, obsidian-coloured growths. Its fur was patchy and sloughing off, and its eyes were a dead, flat red. It looked like a wolf that had been put through a meat grinder and stitched back together by a madman. "Meet the Colossus," Marcus smiled, his voice amplified by the warehouse acoustics. "My masterpiece. He has the strength of 100 alphas, but he's unstable. He needs a stabilizer. He needs a final, pure dose of Seer blood to become immortal." Marcus looked at me, his eyes devoid of the fatherly warmth I had trusted for years. "The trade is off, Elena. You aren't here to buy her back. You're here to join the collection." Chapter 9. The Siege of the Shadow. The air in the warehouse didn't just turn cold. It turned heavy, vibrating with a frequency that made my teeth ache. The silence was brittle, broken only by the wet, ragged breathing of the Colossus. Marcus stood on the catwalk, his thumb hovering over the detonator, a smug grin playing on his lips. He looked like a man who had already won. "Kill the alpha," Marcus commanded, his voice a sharp, clinical snap. "But leave the girl intact. I need her heart pumping." The Colossus didn't howl. It didn't roar. It simply moved, a mountain of corrupted muscle and obsidian fur that blurred across the concrete floor. Silas didn't hesitate. He shifted in mid-air, his clothes tearing away as his body expanded into the massive silver-grey wolf of the Blackwood line. The two beasts slammed into each other with a sound like 2 freight trains colliding. The impact sent a shockwave through the building, shattering the glass of the observation office. The fight was a symphony of carnage. Silas was faster, a silver streak of lethal precision, but the Colossus was a juggernaut. Every time Silas landed a blow that should have been fatal, the obsidian growths on the monster's skin pulsed with a sickly light, knitting the flesh back together instantly. "Run, Sarah!" I screamed, seeing my sister cower as a piece of machinery was tossed across the room like a toy. Sarah scrambled away into the shadows of the loading docks, but Marcus wasn't looking at her anymore. He was focused on me. He reached behind his back and produced a heavy, custom-built rifle loaded with silver-tipped rounds. "You were always my favourite, Elena," Marcus shouted over the din of the battle. "So much potential, so much power hidden behind those spreadsheets and court filings. You could have ruled them all. Why choose a dying king when you can lead a new world?" He fired. The silver bullet grazed my shoulder, a line of white-hot fire that felt like a brand. I didn't fall. Instead, the pain acted like a key in a lock. The rage I had been suppressing, the betrayal, the years of manipulation, the terror for my sister, it all coalesced into a single brilliant point of light behind my eyes. I felt the pulse. It wasn't a distant thrum anymore, it was a roar. I reached out with my hand, my fingers splayed toward the catwalk. I didn't have a gun. I didn't have a wolf's claws. But I had the blood of the Seers. I focused on Marcus's heartbeat, arrogant, fast, and fundamentally rotten. I imagined my own silver light reaching out not to heal him, but to show him the weight of his own ledger. Marcus froze. His finger, which had been tightening on the trigger for a second shot, went slack. His eyes went wide, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks as a vision of every life he had snuffed out, every hybrid he had tortured, and every ancestor he had betrayed began to play out in his mind at 1,000 frames per second. It was the Seer's curse, the absolute unyielding truth of one's own soul. "No, get out of my head," he shrieked, dropping the rifle. He clutched his temples, falling to his knees as the psychic weight of his crimes crushed his sanity. On the floor below, Silas felt the shift in the air. With the Colossus momentarily confused by the sudden loss of Marcus's mental command, Silas lunged. He didn't just bite, he channeled the silver light I had given him in the forest. His claws glowed with a lunar radiance as he tore into the center of the Colossus's chest, ripping out the corrupted core that fueled its unnatural life. The giant beast fell with a sound like a collapsing skyscraper, its body dissolving into a puddle of black, oily sludge. I walked toward the catwalk, the silver light from my veins illuminating the darkness. I didn't kill Marcus with a blade. I simply stood there, forcing him to witness the truth until his mind snapped under the gravity of it. He collapsed into a catatonic heap, his eyes staring at nothing, his mouth hanging open in a silent, permanent scream. I turned to see Silas shifting back, his body battered and bloodied, but his eyes burning with a fierce, protective pride. And he looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see an asset or a victim. He saw his equal. "It's over," I whispered, the light in my hands slowly fading. Chapter 10. 2 weeks had passed since the warehouse had burned, its black smoke carrying away the last remnants of Marcus's twisted ambition. The Blackwood Estate felt different now. The suffocating tension that had gripped the land was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. The fog had lifted, revealing rolling green hills and a forest that felt protective rather than predatory, its ancient branches swaying in a rhythmic greeting. Sarah was recovering in one of the sun-drenched guest rooms in the East Wing. Her laughter, which I had feared I'd never hear again, was finally returning as she spent her afternoons in the gardens, protected by the most elite sentinels of the pack. She didn't know the full extent of what I was, and she didn't need to. Not yet. I stood on the stone balcony of the library, the silver ledger open on the railing in front of me. I had spent the last 14 days immersed in its pages, learning the true history of my people, the seers who had stood beside the alphas since the dawn of the first pack. We were the balance, they were the claw, and we were the vision. The sound of soft, rhythmic footsteps echoed behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. I could feel his heartbeat, steady, powerful, and inextricably linked to my own. Silas stepped out onto the balcony, his presence a warm weight at my side. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore a simple black sweater, his sleeves pushed up to reveal the scars that were now part of our shared history. He looked out over the cliffside, then turned his amber eyes toward me. "The gates are open, Elena," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that felt like a caress. "There is a car waiting at the bottom of the drive. I've had your apartment in Chicago cleaned, and your accounts secured. You can go back. You can try to find that normal life again." I looked down at the ledger, then out at the forest. I could feel them, hundreds of heartbeats pulsing in the dark, waiting for a sign. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a debt collector looking for a missing asset. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. "I don't think I'm very good at normal anymore, Silas," I said, turning to face him. "Normal people don't see the truth in men's souls. Normal people don't have blood that glows like the moon." I picked up an old-fashioned fountain pen from the railing. I turned to the final pristine page of the ledger, the one following the record of Marcus's treachery. In clear, elegant script, I wrote my own name, Elena Vance, High Seer and Auditor of the Blackwood Pack. Silas's breath hitched. He looked at the ink, then at me, and I saw a flash of vulnerability in his eyes that he had never shown another soul. Without a word, he dropped to one knee, not as a beast submitting to a master, but as a king finally finding his queen. He took my hand, his thumb brushing over the silver scar on my palm, and pressed a lingering kiss to the skin. "The pack has been waiting for its heart for a very long time," he whispered. I looked out over the horizon. As the sun began to dip below the trees, thousands of pairs of eyes began to glow in the twilight. They weren't circling us anymore. They weren't hunting. One by one, the shadows of the forest lowered their heads. "The debt is paid, Silas," I said, my voice carrying across the valley, steady and sovereign. "But our story is just beginning."
Thanks for watching till the end. I hope you found this story very enjoyable. It reminds us that when two people, like Silas and Elena, come to know what is within them, the potential that lies within them, and they work as a team, there is no limit to what they can achieve. Let us think about this with our spouses and people we are in a relationship with. When we truly understand the strength that is within us and we work together with them, learning to put aside our differences and things that seems to separate us, we are able to achieve much more than we can. We are able to achieve much more than we could have done as individuals. Thank you very much for watching till the end. Please support us by subscribing to this channel so that whenever we have an upload like this, you will be first to be notified. See you in the next one. Stay enchanted.